Thank you for braving this incredibly warm environment. The heat of the public inquiry clearly isn't bringing that many interested guests, but it is something which outside of this room seems to be very, very popular amongst politicians. Our brief intro is in the years between the late 1990s, the Macpherson inquiry into the death of Stephen Lawrence, and the current Leveson inquiry into press ethics. The public inquiry has come to play a prominent role in British political life. But is there something to be concerned about when the political sphere is bypassed in favour of the judiciary and specially selected panel members? It may be called a public inquiry, but the public's playing no role in the formation of an inquiry's judgment. Shouldn't it be politicians who hold the government to account on behalf of those they represent, the actual public? We have three fantastic speakers. First, immediately on my right, is John Holbrook, who is a practicing barrister and has written widely on a number of areas of law. Says he has particular interest in the way that political issues are assumed to have legal solutions. So you can see that might be why we have that in our immediate introduction to the session. He's written for Spite and for the New Law Journal. He's previously spoken at the Battle of Ideas about cases that rob negligence its meaning. See the sliding scale in the New Law Journal if you want to see any more on that. Particularly, he practices in public law. On my far left, we have Lee Hughes, CBE, who is a former senior civil servant. He is the secretary to the Alexander Litvinenko inquest. He was the secretary to the Hutton inquiry, to the Baha Musa inquiry, to the inquest into the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, and Dodi Al-Fayed, and he was also the lead official on the Protection of Harassment Act and the Freedom of Information Act. That is the process of passing them through Parliament, isn't it? The process of getting everyone to agree and sign off on them. I'm sure that was no mean feat. And he was also in charge of implementing data protection across all of central government, which sounds like one of the most terrifying jobs to be given I've ever heard of. Then, on my close left, we have John Cooper QC, who is leading criminal and human rights barrister, and whose biography won't come up on my iPad.
There you go.
Enigmatic. He is enigmatic. I can see from here that in 2008 he was shortlisted as Human Rights Barrister of the Year by the Law Society. He does huge amounts of work on inquests and has worked on public inquiries, and is a bit of a media guru in the law world. I think he's one of our most high-profile QCs outside of the courtroom as well as inside. So, Lee, thank you very much.
If, like me, you wear glasses, and if, like me, you're slightly forgetful, you will have undoubtedly asked the question on occasions, where have I left my glasses? And that is an inquiry. And indeed, if you make the statement to people around you, it's a public inquiry. Now, I use this example not because one would dignify trying to find your glasses with the title of the public inquiry, but merely to illustrate that the way we, as human beings, conduct our business is by inquiry. We ask questions, we receive answers, we analyse those answers, and we reach conclusions. And however you dress that up, that's an inquiry. And I think the point I want to make in my introduction, the main point, is that there are different types of inquiry, and the important thing to do is not to argue whether we should be conducting inquiries, but to be arguing whether we are conducting the right kind of inquiry. And if I can just give a few illustrations. The Baha Musa inquiry, which I was secretary to and reported almost exactly a year ago, looked into allegations of war crimes allegedly committed by British troops in Iraq, and also at why a clear instruction from a former British Prime Minister that certain interrogation techniques would never be used by British troops was not only ignored, but those techniques became standard operating procedure. That was a judge-led inquiry. The chairman was a judge, and all of those giving evidence to the inquiry had the opportunity to be legally represented, and the whole process was conducted in a very formal legal way. And I think that was right. That was the right kind of procedure to use for that inquiry, because the effect of the report would have been and was to accuse a number of people of, in effect, criminal activity, even though, of course, the public inquiry couldn't find liability for criminal acts. It could certainly say, this person did that thing, and it did. And therefore, in that context, that format, this very legalistic format, was probably the right one. You might want to contrast that to the Hillsborough panel that has recently reported. That was still an inquiry. It didn't hold any public hearings, but what it did was manage to obtain all the public documents, or documents held by public authorities, and indeed some private organisations, relating to the particular disaster, publish them with a commentary, and in effect the outcome of that was that everybody knew everything that had happened, and if people were condemned, they were condemned by their own thoughts and actions at the time. There now have to be further investigations into some of the things that have come out of that inquiry, but again, that was a different kind of inquiry, and one which was relevant and right for the circumstances that were under investigation. Then one can look at other issues, and in the introduction that Richard gave us, there was the issue, if it's a public inquiry, should the public be involved? Well, I think in Baha Musa the answer was no. The public generally didn't have any information to give the inquiry to help inform its deliberations. Of course, the proceedings should be in public, but the public themselves didn't have much to offer. But there are other circumstances, and I'll give you two examples, where I think there have been inquiries, or reports certainly, where the public were not sufficiently engaged in the process. The cost of social care for the elderly and tuition fees for university students. There has been great controversy over those things because the reports that came didn't, I think, take into account all the strands of opinion from the public, analyse them, and try to reach a consensus. And those two issues are big issues that we do need to have consensus about if we're going to move forward. And one can perhaps even draw a further conclusion that, given this is a media theme, that with our current 24-hour media, that politicians don't get any time or space to develop policies. There is an instant reaction, or a demand for an instant reaction to anything that happens. Look at a good example at the moment, all the accusations that are now currently being made about Jimmy Savile. Press and the media are demanding something must be done, and something must be done now. What you really need to do is to look very carefully about how and why things happened before you develop the solutions. But politicians don't get that opportunity, I think, that space to develop policy. Therefore, we get rushed into, I think, quite often bad decisions. Dangerous Dogs Act is a very good example of that. So my proposition is public inquiries are a good thing, but just make sure you get the right format and right process and procedures that's fair and proportionate to the issue under consideration. Thank you.
John.
Thanks, Richard. Just in terms of the sort of nature and scope of the problem here, the New Statesman is keeping a tally of the number of times that Ed Miliband calls for a public inquiry. And at the last time of counting, and it may have gone up since I last looked at the New Statesman, it was 9. Everything from Jimmy Savile, phone hacking, breast implants, rail franchises, GCSE exams, banks, cash for access, riots and care home abuse. So there's no doubt, and let's not forget, the leader of the opposition has only held that post for just about 2 years. So that's an annual rate of about 4.5 a year, if my maths is not letting me down. But in addition to the number of inquiries he's called for, let's not forget as well that Cameron has set up the mother of all public inquiries in terms of the Leveson inquiry, investigating the press. And Also, I know it's not a judicial inquiry, but there is also the Commons Home Affairs Select Committee, which is now looking at banking and banking services in general. And in addition to those inquiries, there are also ongoing inquiries. Many of them don't make it into the public news, but one that certainly has and will in the next few months is the Chilcot inquiry, which Gordon Brown set up towards the end of his government, which is looking into Britain's role in Iraq. So there is no shortage of public inquiries which are either being called for or are happening. But it's not just the number of them that troubles me, it's their nature. And I do think that something quite specific is happening with regards to most of these inquiries, and that is the extent to which they are focusing on perceived institutional problems. Now, I make that point in contrast to the way in which public inquiries used to be used, which was traditionally that they were used with a fairly narrow focus in order to address particular incidents or particular personal failings. So going back over the years, we had Profumo, we had Bloody Sunday in 1972, we had an inquiry into the Falklands War, and then there were a number about particular matters of public concern to do with safety, such as King's Cross, Clapham rail disaster, Piper Alpha, oil rig disaster and the Marchioness disaster, to name just a few. And the point is that most of those inquiries had a fairly specific and narrow focus. Now, what tends to be happening now with the call for a public inquiry is that the focus is very much on at an institutional level. I think you see that very clearly with the calls for the Jimmy Savile inquiries, which are now happening. And incidentally, the BBC has said, aping the language of Cameron from the Leveson inquiry, that they are setting up their own inquiry, which is looking at culture and practices within the BBC. So there you see immediately the whole way in which an organisation was organised many decades ago is under scrutiny. And much the same with banks as well. It's not about a specific banking issue, it's more about the banking culture. And I think as well, even where inquiries have perhaps a more narrow focus, and I think you could say this about the Baha Musa and al-Swedi inquiries, can be critical of the military, they tend to assume a more significant consequence. In other words, we tend to look at these problems not as isolated problems, but more sort of fault lines that run through the whole of the military. So I think that's what's really quite noticeable about these inquiries which are happening at the moment. And the question I want to ask is, why is it happening? And it seems to me the answer to that question is really to be found by focusing on the loss of support that these institutions now have, particularly from the public and, moreover, from the establishment themselves. So I think you can see that very much with the Leveson inquiry, where there was a lot of public unease about what the press had been doing. But moreover, within the press industry itself, there were very few individuals or organisations who took a principled stand against the setting up of the Leveson inquiry. And you can see exactly the same over the last week or two with the calls for the Jimmy Savile inquiry, with no one really coming out to defend the BBC and saying, look, for goodness sake, this all happened decades ago. Jimmy Savile is dead. End of. No one felt as if they had the authority to come out and say that, so that the BBC could get on with the business of producing and showing TV programmes. And I think that is all symptomatic of these twofold problems of the public lacking support for these institutions and also the establishment not being in a position to defend them either. And so what we're left with is these inquiries which focus on these institutions which undoubtedly have fault lines. And whereas I think a lot of their supporters would say these inquiries can help to heal these fault lines and set about the business of garnering some public support for them, I have to say I think they will have exactly the opposite effect. And this is one of the problems with the elite nature of public inquiries, the fact that they do not really engage the public in any meaningful debate about what these institutions ought to be doing. So with Leveson, for example, there ought to be a public debate about free speech. And if there was a debate about the importance of free speech, then it would be possible to gain much more public support for the notion of the press. And until that happens, that's not going to happen. And I think it's clear that Leveson is just going to further promote the fragmentation of these institutions. Just finally, and I mention this so that hopefully we can discuss it more in the debate, I think the fact that we are calling usually for members of the judiciary to head up these inquiries is symptomatic of the fact that the judiciary are one of the few institutions which has not been subject to the same sort of critical scrutiny that other institutions have experienced in the last decade or so. And the only point I would make about this, and this is perhaps something we can discuss further, is that by getting them out of the courtroom and away from a terrain which they are used to, and in putting them into forums that they are not used to and where they do not make decisions within a legal framework, then the likelihood is that they as an institution will also start suffering from the sorts of fragmentations and loss of support which has hitherto affected other institutions.
Thank you again. It's interesting to remind ourselves that, as far as I'm aware, the very first public inquiry, I don't know whether you can guess when it was held. As an informed audience, you probably know the answer. But the very first public inquiry was held in 1847, and that was held into the poor state of education in Wales. That was the very first public inquiry, and they had a slow start. But my goodness me, now are they quickening up the pace? Because as John Wan said a moment ago, not only do we have now a number of inquiries, some we're still waiting to report, others being requested. And it's not only Ed Miliband who's been calling for a public inquiry as a knee-jerk response every time a single issue arises. Add to that public inquiries being called into the state of Shrewsbury Market, beef, Catholics, to name but a three extra. And in many respects, the first headline point I'd put out for debate is that I would argue that the currency, the mark of the public inquiry is being devalued by the constant calls for them and the potential overuse of them. In many respects, one gets the feeling, certainly when one hears politicians of all persuasions calling for public inquiries, they are often ill-thought-out calls. One only needed to listen to Harriet Harman, for instance, on the BBC News a few days ago, calling for a public inquiry along with others into the Jimmy Savile allegations. A moment's questioning of her indicated that she hadn't really thought out the focus of the inquiry, the realities of gaining evidence for an inquiry, and exactly what the results and benefits of an inquiry would be. And this is just one example of these knee-jerk calls for a public inquiry, which often get people off the hook, get politicians off the hook, maybe get the legal system off the hook. Call for a public inquiry, that will always put it right. I don't think anyone on this panel is arguing, and it'd be interesting to hear your views in a moment, that we should not have public inquiries. Public inquiries have a place, in my view, in the panoply of tools that we have in a democratic society. And I would put 4 suggestions to you as to where a public inquiry can be useful. They can be useful, 1, in seeking to restore confidence. 2, to examine failures, and particularly systemic failures. 3, and yes, I argue it, to apportion blame, if appropriate. And 4, to make recommendations. Now, those that are familiar with the coronial system will see that there's a significant overlap there with the purposes and objectives of the coroner's court and of the inquest procedure, of which I am somewhat familiar. And I have seen, for instance, in inquests I've dealt with, the deep cut inquest, the Hercules inquest, the Puma inquest, and others, that in those relatively sweeping inquests, if I can put it that way, dealing with sweeping systemic issues like bullying and education in deep cut and safety generally of forces personnel in hurricane aircraft, the inquest itself very much takes on the role, in all but name, I would suggest, of a public inquiry. But as far as deep cut was concerned, it had the extra benefit, which I will be pushing hard during this debate. And you know what that extra benefit was? It was a jury. It was the involvement of the public, our peers, in making a decision. I'm not going to tell too many war stories, because that gets boring. But the one war story I will tell you is that the verdict the coroner wanted in Deep Cut was not the verdict the jury came up with. God bless the jury. And so in many respects, we lose that sort of involvement. It's a point made a moment ago, of the public, the direct involvement of the public. That's not to say the public are always involved with inquests, because getting a jury nowadays is an exceptional thing. But at least the opportunity is there. So if those 4 criteria which I put forward do not apply, then I say no public inquiry in any event. But let's remind ourselves, public inquiries are expensive. Someone's bound to mention Bloody Sunday. That's a bad example. And now times are changing as far as that's concerned. But they are expensive. We should discuss as well. I'm just laying down headlines here for discussion. What are the remedies that a public inquiry have, apart from recommendations? What's the force? What's the power they have, apart from, in many respects, allowing us to ventilate an issue? That's not to say there haven't been some very good public inquiries. Shipman, I think, stands up arms and shoulders above others. I have to say, we may fall out on this one. Hutton leaves a lot to be desired. I'm biased. I represented those wanting to reopen the inquest into the Dr. Kelly death. But I think Hutton effectively did not do the job. The witnesses in Hutton were not on oath. And I've seen correspondence and argued this in the court and seen a letter from Lord Hutton where he says he doesn't think witnesses need to be on oath. And he said he doesn't think expert witnesses need to be on oath. Now, in my view, there is one inquiry where we have the leader of the inquiry saying, well, those aren't very important. We can discuss all the things that Hutton missed out. So, but let me say this. I've got the. Okay. Can I just lay one thing on the table? Tomorrow I fly out to The Hague, and I'm going to get involved with something called the Iran Tribunal. And I'd like to discuss also the place that Bertrand Russell-type tribunals can have. Now, I know I've got a red card, but let me just explain what Bertrand...
Do go ahead.
Because I think it is important, because this is one of the areas that haven't been touched on. These are people's tribunals. They were originally set up by Bertrand Russell in the 1960s to deal with the Vietnam War. We're having one in The Hague next week into the torture allegations against the Iranian Republic in the 1980s, where 20,000 people were killed. This tribunal has been set up by interested parties with senior jurists, lawyers, international academics judging it and doing it. And we're off to The Hague to prosecute it. So there's another angle. As well as the Hillsborough mark, the Hillsborough model, there's the Bertrand Russell model. So big discussions, and I'll shut up.
Thank you. It was very, very interesting. I'm going to just ask one question to the panel, which I'd like them each to respond to first. Then I'm going to come out to the audience for both your questions and your points. Could you lay out for me if you think there are any subjects which are totally inappropriate for a public inquiry, and if so, what they are?
No, I think what I was trying to do was to really broaden out the definition of public inquiry. I was a civil servant for 35 years, and I just wish that one Act of Parliament in that time had been based on evidence, evidence-based policy making. It's a great totem. Every government comes in saying we're going to legislate on the basis of evidence, and none of them ever do. And one of the things I think I would like to see is a great deal more investigation, inquiry type activity ahead of decisions being made. And that's why I did try to broaden out the definition of public inquiry, because I think there does need to be more investigation, discussion and debate, which in many cases ought to involve the public in some way. I agree with this John here in his comment about having a jury. I was the secretary to the Diana inquest, where we had a jury, Diana and Dodie. The jury, again, I think, reached a verdict which wasn't quite the verdict that the lawyers were expecting, but it shut everything up. Yes. All the conspiracy theories that had been going on for 10 years suddenly ended. because a jury had said, this is unlawful killing, and that ended.
Should have had a jury and kick Dr. Kelly, shouldn't we?
Well, if I may, just very briefly.
No, I did
I
that to provoke you.
We are going to disagree on that. The big problem with the report of the Hutton inquiry was that a lot of people thought that his terms of reference were a great deal wider than they were.
Yeah,
and if you stick to the terms of reference, which he did, then I don't think you can criticise his verdict. You can say he should have had wider terms of reference, and if you say that, I would say, yes, you could have come
That's
to
a fair comment, I accept
but that's where we were. And as secretary to his inquiry, if he had tried to go further than his terms of reference, I would have had to stop him.
No, I take that point. I think we're agreeing the terms of reference should have been wider.
Yeah. So I did want to make that point.
Yeah,
but,
sure.
but otherwise, so I'm really saying, in that wider definition I'm trying to put forward today, I would say, anything really ought to be the subject of proper inquiry, investigation and debate.
You're almost suggesting it's part of a legislative process, almost.
Well, not just legislation, because, again, we had some suggestions of the kinds of things that what you might call a more traditional public inquiry might look at, and that's fair enough. And I think you wouldn't necessarily have legislation from apportioning blame, and it may not be legislation; it may be systemic failings.
Mm-hmm. Is there legitimate scope for public inquiries? Well, if there is, then I think the gateposts make it pretty narrow. Because on the one side, you've got the criminal law, and for example, where you have wrongdoing, such as phone hacking, then that is quite properly an issue for the criminal law to deal with. Then on the other side, you have got public debate. So the question really is, are there any issues and problems that need to be resolved, which cannot be resolved by either of those two avenues? And I suspect there are, but they are few and far between. One of the reasons why I think people don't appreciate that today is because so many political problems are assumed to be problems in which an inquiry into the facts can give you the answer. And perhaps one good example of that is the Iraq War, where we have now had 3 public inquiries. It started off with Hutton into the death of David Kelly, then we had Butler into the use of intelligence, and now we have Chilcot, which is a much more general inquiry into Britain's role in the Iraq War. Now, for heaven's sake, what is it that we need to know about the Iraq War that we do not already know? What is it that we need to know in order to come to a conclusion about whether Britain's involvement in that war was right or wrong? They are political decisions, and which all of us can make our own minds up, helped by a process of public debate, but not helped at all by this idea that there can be a public inquiry that can assist us in that process by inquiring into the facts and then passing a judgment on those facts.
Yeah, I'm just picking up on that. I see the point, but one of the things that the public inquiry have in the Iraq War, and I'd see those 3 public inquiries all as one with different terms of reference, effectively, Part 1, Part 2 and Part 3, is attempt to get disclosure. Yes, we can have public debate as far as the Iraq War is concerned. I don't want to get sidetracked onto a different debate here, but yes, we can have public debate on the Iraq War, but what these inquiries can do is try to achieve disclosure of documentation that the public should never get, and therefore expose potential misdeeds by those that govern us. But going back to the original question, I emphasise again, I'm saying there should be limited public inquiries. They can be overused. And I should say again that one of the big problems with public inquiries being ordered too quickly is that they will hold up the criminal process. Look at Leveson, for instance. Trials of people who are accused of certain things there are now not going to take place, I think, until September of next year. Now, the public inquiry, as I say, can hold up a process. But I don't think that we can say in answer to your question and be too definitive about where there should be a public inquiry and where there shouldn't be a public inquiry. It depends. For instance, Shipman, I go back to Shipman again, that was ostensibly a public inquiry about the actions of one man, which extended into some very, very important recommendations as far as death registration is concerned, and coronial practice as far as death death investigation is concerned, and that was a very, very important inquiry. Now, initially, a knee-jerk response might have been, well, it's only, sadly and tragically, to do with one man's appalling criminal behaviour. But when one looked closely, that was a whole systemic issue, which I have to say that inquiry has produced some very, very effective recommendations which have been put into effect, which will make sure, I boldly say, that sort of thing can never happen again. So I go back, in short, and to conclude, to those four reasons that I posited a moment ago. If those four reasons, that confidence needs to be restored, failures need to be examined, systemic particularly, there is a need, a public need for blame to be apportioned or accountability to be assessed, and there is a need for recommendations for the future, then whatever the issue might be, if those criteria are met, I say a public inquiry.
I think the important issue here is to recognise the changing issues that inquiries are being asked to address. I actually had the first public inquiries about 40 years after John's, and my understanding was it was a judicial inquiry into the process of awarding contracts in trade in South Africa, some kind of process failure which led to a judicial inquiry. And that was quite characteristic, as I understand it, of the inquiries at the time, is that they were narrowly focused on correcting processes within the state which had caused some undesirable outcome. So very, very narrowly focused on fixing a particular process. Jump forward, about 80 years, and you have the Victoria Kalimbe inquiry, a completely different kind of inquiry, because it was geared towards combating risk. It took an egregious act of child abuse and effectively presented it as an issue which permeated a particular area of public life. And for that reason, it gave itself the task of managing the risks around adults' relationship with young people. And that was a significant expansion of what public inquiries were doing. Now, what's particularly worrying about Leveson is that it's actually gone even further, because there, in the terms of reference of the Leveson inquiry, is the word ethics. So we now have public inquiries who are effectively setting themselves the task of defining press ethics. Now, that's a very different beast to effectively a process by which internal processes were assessed. This is something which is a mechanism which was once used to address the internal workings of the state, being transposed to deal with issues of public life. And for that reason, I think, whilst there are inquiries and inquiries, the manner of inquiries that are evolving at the moment are extremely worrying.
Just to say that I think it's undeniably true that the politicians are trying to divert from their own responsibilities by announcing and encouraging inquiries. You can see it in the way that they operate, and that should be fully recognised. I think it's important to say. One area you haven't touched on, and I'd be interested in your views, is the degrees to which judges or the leaders, QCs, who are leading these inquiries actually are tempted to go beyond their remit. We haven't talked about the Lawrence inquiry, but out of that there was a statement that the police were institutionally racist. There was no evidence produced, as far as I can tell, that they were institutionally racist, but because it was part of a very high-profile public inquiry, it became true that if you like, it became a truism that they were institutionally racist. And so I just wonder, what mechanisms do you think we can put in place to make sure that when we do have these public inquiries, that the judges and the QCs don't get carried away with themselves, which is certainly a possibility in Leveson.
Surely not.
It's a possibility in Leveson, and I hope that it doesn't happen, because I don't think there's anything wrong with the Leveson inquiry. And by the way, on the point that Luke just made, I think it's wrong to say that they're going to establish ethics. I think the key element of, or establish what ethics should be, the key element of a public inquiry that you didn't mention in your 4 points is to fact-finding. And the judges, I think the judges are particularly good at fact-finding, an awful lot less good on recommendations. And I hope that out of Leveson and all the other inquiries, we get a little bit less confidence in their recommendations, but real confidence in their ability to find facts and identify wrongdoing.
I have to say that the whole public inquiry thing, I kind of feel the hairs going up on my spine, because it seems to me, of old, they've always seemed to me as being about politicians, you know, copping out and privatising responsibility instead of taking it for themselves, and about entirely bypassing the public. I mean, we all knew what happened on Bloody Sunday, and especially, you know, people in the north of Ireland knew what the soldiers had done to unarmed civilians, and also people knew exactly what happened at Hillsborough. And I think people also knew exactly what happened in the Iraq War. I mean, I think this is nonsense. So the first thing I want to know is, isn't this about politicians copping out, and isn't it about bypassing the public? And why on earth do unelected judges have this unbelievable capacity to find the truth, regardless of whether they've ever had poked their nose in to what's going on in Iraq, Ireland or anywhere else? That really winds me up. Secondly, I'm very interested in John's point, because it is a concern, and I don't know...
Which John?
This John Holbrook, his point about the shift to institutions, you almost then end up having attacked the judiciary. I almost feel I then have to defend them, because there does seem to be an institutional self-annihilation, just as there's almost been a parliamentary annihilation. Crisis of confidence, farm it out to judges, keep the public out of the way. BBC can't make a decision, goes for lots of other institutions. There is this sort of, I don't know if what you could call it, looking in on yourself. This crisis of legitimacy seems to be across the board, and maybe in those circumstances we have to damn well defend some institutions, which I would find highly annoying. And my final point is that this policy based on evidence-based policy or whatever, I just find awful. Instead of having a political vision of how you want society to be and what you think is right, you have to find some evidence. How ridiculous is that? It's like hiding behind the science. Or sending Sarah Catt to jail is a good example.
I did 2 projects with Tukes Chambers, Michael Mansfield. One was the death of Jean-Charles de Menezes, and the second was the Diana trial. 2 very different inquests. My point is that I discovered as artist in residence during this time that the purpose of these sort of inquests seems to be a sense of sort of group therapy in sort of in a kind of clumsy way. There's a need for sort of a moment of catharsis, whether that's through gathering evidence, whether that's through expression of the facts, whether that's through public apology. My question is this is not for me what an inquest is for. An inquest, in my very sort of pedestrian language, is to actually right wrong in a sense of whether that's an act of racism, the serious stuff that we really need to change within our society. So instead of the inquest, for example, what is the alternative?
Do you mean an inquest or a public inquiry?
Public inquiry, sorry.
Right.
So it's sort of, what is the alternative for the public? So there's obviously an appetite for sort of gathering knowledge and information, sort of as a sort of catharsis, a sort of sense of cleansing. So what's the alternative? Where are people going to kind of experience that feeling? So it's more of a sort of philosophical point of view that if John Cooper could answer, sure. I'd be very interested. Sure.
Do you want me to deal with Sarah's point?
You could answer that one
directly. Well, funnily enough, Mike is out on the Iran tribunal with me next week. He's sitting as one of the judges on that tribunal, and dealing with Sarah with alternatives, it does give me an opportunity, by the way, this wasn't a setup, to actually refer to more about the alternatives, which are people's tribunals. There is, for instance, one which was set up in Hillsborough, we've heard touch upon, which was admittedly behind closed doors, not because of anything sinister, but to allow people to consider the evidence and then to report transparently within a publicly accessible report. People on there, the Bishop of Liverpool, various activists were on there as well. That was accessible. That's one alternative. And my goodness me, has that really hit the mark? I mean, what a tremendous success that particular alternative was. And I know that Mike is a strong exponent of permanent independent panels. And let me take this opportunity of supporting him on that. But again, there is the Bertrand Russell alternative, whereby interest groups, activists, people, victims, get together, make their own tribunal of academics, of lawyers, not just lawyers, sometimes individuals, be they journalists, be they writers, put them together into a tribunal and present the evidence gathered by the victims to that tribunal. and to allow the evidence to come out. Now, we've done that in the commission hearings of the Iran Tribunal earlier on this year with Amnesty. As I said, we now go on to The Hague and do it at that venue as well. That's an alternative as well, where victims take the initiative, and put together their own tribunals to allow evidence to be heard. Of course, there's also the inquest, the good old inquest as an alternative, and that indeed has the benefits of evidence on oath, juries at times, and also a detailed and focused analysis on the issues there. But I do finally accept what you say about public inquiries. They are, and I think it touches upon Peter's observation as well. They are very much used as a sop at times to the public, for politicians to avoid taking responsibility, and for politicians to avoid giving answers. And then when we finally do get a public inquiry, we have the problem that I think that Lee and I both agree on, for instance with Hutton, is that often the terms of reference aren't adequate anyway.
One thing I'd like, it was the first point made, I think it was Luke, is this issue of perhaps the role of inquiries moving from analysing elements of what's going on in the state to analysing things which are going on in society more broadly. We'll come back to John on my right.
I just want to say a few words about Hillsborough, because I think it helps us to address two of the questions that have been raised. First of all, I mean, going back to 1989, everybody who wanted to know the truth about what happened to Hillsborough was capable of knowing the truth in 1989. I mean, not just because a great many people were there who witnessed it firsthand, but also because it was broadcast on TV. I mean, there was no doubt that the police story that this had anything to do with the fans misbehaving was rubbish, and that this was a cock-up organised and orchestrated by the police. Now, that is the truth that anyone who wanted to know it could have known at the time. So why is it that here we are 20 years later, we still have a great many victims who are campaigning to get the truth as they see it stamped with the state's seal of approval? I don't understand that, and I do think that is a problem. This idea that we have to get the state to ratify something as being the truth before we can know it as the truth is really quite wrong. It undermines our own ability to make assessments for ourselves. Now, the other interesting point that arises out of Hillsborough is the way in which the establishment attitude towards these institutions has changed so much in the last 20 years. Because Lord Justice Peter Taylor, when he did his report on Hillsborough in 1989, also hit the nail on the head. He recognised that there was no truth in the police allegations, and furthermore, he recognised and stated that it was a police cock-up. He didn't use those words, but that was the thrust of it. And interestingly enough, Thatcher, now we have the cabinet minutes of the time, said that she was very concerned because it was such a devastating critique of what the police had done at the time. Now, in 1989, that was never the spin that was put on the report. Here we are more than 20 years later, and we've now recently had the panel inquiry that John Cooper just mentioned under the Bishop of Liverpool, which, interestingly enough, was not a proper inquiry. It was just a review of all the documents. And the truth of the matter is that there are very few additional documents that have come forth over the last 20 years. I know there's been a few, there have been these police statements which have been changed, but they do not change our fundamental understanding of Hillsborough. And yet, despite the fact that there has been no fundamental change in the underlying facts or our knowledge of them, the state's attitude to the Bishop of Liverpool's report is so different from the state's attitude in 1989. So here we are now, and we have recently launched the largest ever IPCC investigation into what the police did more than 20 years ago. The largest ever independent police complaints commission investigation. I mean, this is really informative, I think, about the way the establishment is tearing itself to pieces. Tearing itself to pieces to such an extent that, like Kerry, I also feel the need to defend these institutions now. And I didn't think I would have said that many years ago, but it troubles me that we are now ending up with a police force that is not able to police society in the way that we need it to. We are going to possibly end up with a military that could not, if we needed the military to actually defend the country, defend us. All of these institutions, whether it's from the BBC or the sort of harder side of the state, the police and the military, are coming under such a sustained attack, of which these public inquiries are playing an important part, that I think we need to think seriously about just how far this is going.
I think I worry when people say things like, we knew what happened at Hillsborough 25 years ago, or whatever it was, or we knew what happened at Bloody Sunday. We thought, we had suspicions, and there was evidence there. But you do actually need to investigate the facts and get the evidence together before you can know. And there was some new stuff actually came out of Hillsborough, which wasn't the judge, as you said, judge-led inquiry. The latest one was actually chaired by a bishop. But we got new medical evidence that said a number of the victims could have survived. And that blew a complete hole in the premise of the inquest, which led to the which came up with the original verdict of accidental death. That was worth having. Sorry, it was worth having, and it was worth having that panel.
Well, it was seminal for the step forward.
Absolutely. So I do say that you need to have a proper investigation into these matters. And going back to Bloody Sunday, I don't want to dwell on that, but it's right and proper, if we live in a fair society, that the soldiers should have had the opportunity to put their point of view as well as the victims. I agree entirely with the findings, got no problem with that, but they had the right to make their point of view. So you do have to have proper process, due process and due procedures. And if I can just come back on the point about the institutions of the state. The age of deference is dead. We no longer look up to institutions, not even the monarchy, and say, these are unblemished, these can do no wrong. And we have to live with that somehow. I don't want to go back to the 1950s, where if the police said you were guilty, you were guilty, or well, you know, that kind of thing. I want to be able to challenge the institutions of the state. And the institutions of the state need to be prepared to be challenged. And the best way they can do that, in my view, is by being open, honest and transparent.
I think following on from that, that's vitally important. People have to earn respect nowadays in 21st century Britain. The police have to earn it. The military have to earn it. My goodness me, when I was cross-examining some generals in some of the military inquests I've done, they were looking at me as if they've never been asked a question before in their lives, apart from do they want sugar in their tea. And thank goodness now things are changing, and I think it was very cathartic for me, and I think for those that were watching some of those inquests, that some of this brass were being put under some pressure and being told, and it being suggested to them in terms they were lying. It was very, very cathartic indeed when I was cross-examining some people from St Paul's during the Occupy trial at the end of last year, to be putting to senior people at St Paul's certain things that they were actually part and parcel of the city. They looked at me as if I was Satan appearing from underneath the bowels of St Paul's. But my goodness me, it was quite appropriate that in 21st century Britain we should ask these questions. And that information that came out of the Hillsborough hearings, the Hillsborough inquiry, about, was it 34 or so people, or some figure, could have lived. And that wasn't anywhere near an inquest, was absolutely new, vital, and the cutting blade, in my view, as to what's going to happen in the future. Absolutely essential.
It's just to suggest that perhaps the solution to many of these questions would be to strengthen parliamentary scrutiny of a lot of what happens. Parliament can properly seize itself of ethical questions like culture, media and sport did as a precursor to Levington. It's also actually very good at evidence-based policy. Have a look at what the Public Accounts Select Committee does when you've got the given fixed ends of a policy at assessing whether or not you get value for money in implementing that policy, which feeds back into the system of government procurement and deciding what things to spend your money on in the first place. So perhaps it would be great to see them beefed up like they do in Congress in the United States. And secondly, just a quick word of warning about people's commissions. Demos sponsored a commission for assisted dying, which purported to be an independent commission that would open-mindedly consider whether or not we to have euthanasia on the books in this country. 9 of the 12 commissioners had previously supported euthanasia.
Well, that undermines the whole process, I agree.
And that sort of thing. So, just a word of warning.
On the select committees, my problem with select committees, I've actually gone on the record on this, I've read some of The Guardian on it, which got the politicians against me. The select committees did not have the skills to cross-examine. What happens with select committees, and most MPs will agree with me on this, they have about 3 set questions they want to ask, which is part of their portfolio. And then the next set of questions comes from the next MP. The art of good challenge and cross-examination is consistent questions building up over a period of time. That's my problem, in short, out of breath, with select committees.
I think it's quite helpful to understand the rise of public inquiries through the concept of the breakdown of political authority, and that Parliament and we ourselves no longer feel we have the authority to undertake matters and to make recommendations, to decide what we want. And so judges are still seen as having some sort of authority, and so we're quite happy to palm it off to judges because we think they have authority. I think we should be incredibly worried about the fact that we're now asking judges to do something which they're eminently unsuited to doing, which is telling us what we should do. And I think that anyone interested in the legal profession should be really trying to resist that. Very briefly, the point about what were they called, citizens' tribunals or the Bertrand-Russell model. I think that's even worse in terms of being cathartic and not actually about delivering any actual gains or improvements in society, and just being about making us feel good.
Just briefly, not being a legal expert, I'm not sure if this is true, but to go back to John on your rights point, were they looking for public acknowledgement of wrongdoing so much as a chance to prosecute people who've done wrongdoings? And then to ask a general question, is the problem actually public understanding in that people think these things are looking at deeper issues? Like in Leventon, people think it's looking at press ownership. It's not. People think the issue's been settled. It won't have been. And is that the kind of greater issue?
John on my left.
Okay, judges, QCs attempt to go outside their remit. Judges, what's the importance of them? Pressures of judges, involvement of judges, that sort of question. There are good judges and there are bad judges, but one thing that most judges, however much we might disagree with some of their decisions, what they bring is independence, and I would suggest that the involvement of the judiciary brings that independence. I know I can understand the angst about that, but I still think at the moment that is the tool we have 9 times out of 10 that will enable us to go through the evidence, enable us to fact find, enable us to forensically, within the remit of tribunal, get as close as one can to answers. But for all that, a public inquiry is not a perfect process. There are other nuances which we've discussed, but all these processes are important. But my overall plea is, as it was at the start of all this, let's not overuse them. The old expression, let's not kill the goose that lays the golden egg. Let's just occasionally use it where we have to. But remember, in the past it has produced benefits, providing it's got the right remit, it's got the right personnel within it, and it's given enough time to develop it.
Parliamentary scrutiny versus public inquiry. I think we need to grapple with just what a big problem these inquiries or parliamentary investigations are being asked to deal with. You see, we are not talking these days about a single ship that has sunk. We are not talking about a particular one-off train which has crashed. We are talking about fundamental problems here, about all of our institutions, both public and private, which no longer garner the sort of support which they need to function properly. They no longer know, these institutions themselves do not know what it is that they are supposed to be doing. For example, for decades, the BBC survived with the Reithian idea that it was to educate, entertain and inform. Right? No one talks about that these days, and the BBC does not know what it is supposed to be doing, and the public doesn't know either, and the public is dissatisfied. So we need to somehow build support for these institutions from scratch. You cannot do that with an inquiry, whether it happens in Parliament or whether it happens essentially in the courtroom. These are issues that require public debate, and the widest possible public debate.
First of all, get the tribunal right for the problem under discussion. So it may be you need a judge, it may be you need a bishop, it may be you need a senior civil servant. It depends on the issue. Get that right. Secondly, manage expectations. The point we've discussed on a couple of occasions. The people can get led into thinking the inquiry is about something it isn't. And that's the important thing. Make sure people do understand what it's about. And a very general point, if the issue are problems with the institutions of the state, whether it's the BBC or the military or whoever, they've got to reform themselves. One of the most interesting things, I think, that came out of the Hutton inquiry report was the layer and layers and layers of management within the BBC, and none of whom, it appeared, had any responsibility for anything. And it may be that hasn't changed. I don't know. I don't want to be cruel. But that's another thing. If we're talking about problems with institutions of state, time to reform yourselves.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can we thank our speakers?